Hi, my name is Andrew Perventure. I'm with Be Fresh Consulting. I'm helping to organize these series of commission meetings. Tonight we have presentations from Dr. Kathleen Bush from the New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services. This presentation is in regards to some questions the commission members had in our previous month's meeting. After that, we have a very detailed presentation by Chris Skoglund of New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, in which he will talk specifically about some of our emissions by sector. After this introduction, we will go into both those meetings. They'll play back to back, and then at 7 o'clock, we will start the kickoff of commission discussion. So we will send it over to the beginning of the presentations. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Dr. Kathleen Bush. I'm the Program Manager for the Environmental Public Health Tracking Program at the Division of Public Health Services within the Department of Health and Human Services. Thank you for inviting me here to share some of our work. My presentation is titled, Making the Connection, Air Emissions, Climate Change, and Public Health. Over the next 20 to 30 minutes, I plan to share some slides and information that will introduce the programs and agency resources that exist to support climate change initiatives within the state, present a conceptual map that will help guide our discussion, showcase results from the New England Heat and Health Study, and highlight recent research on RGGI and children's health coming out of Columbia and Boston University, and then share some suggestions for next steps. Here's a quick overview of the programs and staff within the Department of Health and Human Services, DHHS, and the Department of Environmental Services, DES, that are dedicated to climate change and human health. Within DPHS, there is the EPHT program, which I manage, and the Climate and Health program, which Matt Cahalan manages, and he's on the call should folks have more questions about that program. These are both 100% federally funded, and there's approximately 1.25 FTE dedicated to this work. Within DES, there is the Resilience and Adaptation Program and the Climate Change Mitigation Program. I believe Sherry Godlewski shared some slides at the last meeting, and you'll be hearing from Chris Skoglund later today. The point is that we have limited resources to address this very complex environmental health issue within our two agencies. Here's a conceptual diagram that I hope will lay a good foundation for our discussion today. This slide is meant to be a simple illustration that summarizes the link between air emissions, climate change, and human health. Air emissions can be categorized as either criteria air pollutants, such as nitrous oxide, particulate matter, and ozone, or as greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, methane, and ozone. Ozone's a tricky one because it's technically both. But the point is that both types of air emissions have direct effects on human health, increasing the risk of outcomes like asthma. And then the point that I really want to make is that greenhouse gases have an additional impact since they lead to increasing global temperature, thus leading to increasing local temperature. And this increasing temperature has an additional indirect effect on human health. So air emissions have both a direct effect on health outcomes like asthma and an indirect effect due to increasing temperature that can increase the risk of poor health outcomes like asthma. With this conceptual map in mind, I want to take some time now to present results from the Northeast Regional Heat Collaborative Study. This work was done in partnership with colleagues from Brown University, the Rhode Island Department of Health, and the Maine CDC. The goal of this project was to provide sufficient evidence that lowering the National Weather Service heat advisory threshold would be protective for public health. This work was published in Environmental Research, so if you want to review the details, please refer to the complete article. The rationale for this study was pretty straightforward. Heat is a major threat to public health. However, there was limited information at the time linking heat and emergency department visits, focusing on effects in the Northeast, or capturing the impacts outside of large metropolitan areas. So we set out to capture the effects in cities and towns across New England. We focused on 3 questions. How does heat index impact health? And I should say that heat index is a measure that relates to temperature but accounts for humidity. Are current heat advisories issued by the National Weather Service optimal for protecting public health in the Northeast? And what can state and local health agencies do to reduce risk? In the image here, you can see the 15 study areas that were included in the analysis. For those that might be interested in the details, this analysis focused on the summer season from May through September and included approximately 10 years of data from every study area. Study areas were defined as towns within 10 miles of a NOAA weather station. The exposure variable of interest was the daily maximum heat index, and the outcome variables of interest were counts of daily all-cause emergency department visits, counts of daily cause-specific emergency departments like asthma, and counts of all-cause deaths. Jumping right to some results, we saw what you might expect. As heat index increases along the bottom x-axis here, the risk of all-cause ED visits increases. Where this line is equal to 1, there is no association. Where it is less than 1, there's a negative association. And where it is greater than 1, there's a positive association. So you can see that as the heat index goes from about 75 and over, risk starts to increase here. And when you get out to 100 or 105, there's a significant increase in risk of going to the emergency department for any reason. When we look at risk across certain categories, again, as heat index increases along the bottom x-axis, you can see that there is an increased risk of all-cause ED visits here, heat-related visits here, as well as a pretty substantial increase in both renal or kidney-related and asthma or respiratory-related emergency department visits. So in an attempt to summarize our findings, on a day when the maximum heat index was 95, compared to a day when it was 75, we observed that all-cause ED visits went up about 6.6%, that heat-related ED visits went up nearly 90%, that the risk of asthma-related ED visits went up about 25%, and that the risk of all-cause deaths went up nearly 6%. The key point is that health effects occur at moderate heat index values. Yes, even here in New England. Now, if we try to estimate the number of excess or extra ED visits and deaths under future climate scenarios, we can see that there are approximately 334 excess ED visits in Nashua each year associated with days over 90. And so if we just look at Nashua, there were approximately 334 extra ED visits due to days over 90. There are currently about 9 days over 90 in Nashua each year. And under future climate scenarios, there could be anywhere from 5 to 55 additional days above 90. This means 5 times or as many as 55 times as many ED visits per year associated with these extreme heat days. If we switch gears a bit, I want want to bring your attention to a recent publication I came across highlighting the co-benefits to children's health associated with the U.S. Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, also known as RGGI. This is the only study that I know of that tries to make a direct link between greenhouse gas emissions and children's health. Essentially, these researchers used an EPA tool called BenMap to estimate the effect of reducing greenhouse gases under RGGI to quantify changes in preterm birth, low birth weight, autism spectrum disorder, and asthma across RGGI states, which includes New Hampshire. In this table, the authors present the number of estimated avoided cases in RGGI states for 4 health outcomes of interest. They estimated 58 avoided cases of preterm birth, 29 avoided cases of low birth weight, 50 avoided cases of autism spectrum disorder, and 274 avoided cases of asthma. Again, this is across all RGGI states, which includes 9 states. You can see them listed here at the bottom. New Hampshire is one of them. As I mentioned, this is the only study, certainly the most recent study that I know of, trying to make a direct link between reducing air emissions, specifically greenhouse gases, and improving children's environmental health. At this point, I would like to make a few quick side notes to address some questions that were raised at the last meeting. The first point is that, yes, many health outcomes are associated with climate change, especially increasing temperature and changing precipitation patterns. Those outcomes range from respiratory to cardiovascular to vector-borne, food-borne, waterborne, and mental health outcomes. Within the health department, we tend to look to national and international studies to help define these specific relationships. And then we tend to focus our limited resources on either reducing environmental exposures or building healthy communities that are sustainable and can adapt to climate impacts. The second side note has to do specifically with asthma. I spoke with the asthma program and have some data to share. It is true, based on data from the 2017 Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, or BRFIS, that New Hampshire shows the highest adult asthma rate in the country, with a rate of 13.2%. We can see that here in the table. However, it is also true that when you account for uncertainty, or the 95% confidence intervals shown here in the second column, that this rate is not statistically significantly different from other New England states. In fact, when we look at the 2018 data, you can see that New Hampshire now ranks 4th with a rate of 11.8%. And the point is really that New Hampshire and all of New England have some of the highest rates of adult asthma in the country. And we could hypothesize that this might be due to ambient air quality, since New England is really known as the tailpipe of the country, since prevailing weather patterns carry air emissions all the way across the country and up over New England. But we also have to keep in mind that genetics and many other factors play a role. So at this point, I'd like to revisit the conceptual map that I showed at the beginning and give everyone a minute to review it again. The key points here are that air emissions can be categorized as either criteria air pollutants or as greenhouse gases. Both types of air emissions have direct effects on human health. Greenhouse gases have an additional impact since they lead to increasing temperature. And this increasing temperature has an indirect effect on human health. This final slide is my attempt to wrap it all up. Air emissions include both criteria air pollutants and greenhouse gases. Both have direct effects on public health. Increasing temperature has an indirect effect on public health. So these greenhouse gases have essentially a multiplicative effect on public health. And the key point, the real take-home message here, is that by reducing greenhouse gases, we can help stabilize temperature. This will have direct benefits by improving air quality and will have indirect benefits by stabilizing temperature. This is essentially what we call co-benefits. With that, I would like to thank you again for inviting me here today. I'll be happy to answer any questions as time allows. And my contact information is here in case anyone wants to reach out after the meeting. Thanks again, and thank you for your work to keep New Hampshire safe and healthy.
Good evening, and thank you for this opportunity to speak to the New Hampshire Ad Hoc Emission Commission. My name is Chris Gogland. I'm the Climate and Energy Program Manager with the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. Today I've been asked to give a presentation following Dr. Bush from the Department of Health and Human Services, who provided an overview of public health impacts of climate change here in New Hampshire. I'll be focusing on New Hampshire's greenhouse gas emissions, specifically the inventory of gases originating in our geographic boundaries and the influences on those gases that are occurring. Because of the complicated nature of the topic, this is going to give everyone kind of a roadmap of where we're headed so you can understand. I'm going to begin with a differentiation of the two kind of broad classes of air pollutants that can be referred to as emissions, and then briefly touch on the importance of greenhouse gases. Then looking at New Hampshire's contribution to climate change, including the greenhouse gas emissions by sector, the regional influence that we understand to be occurring on New Hampshire's greenhouse gas emissions, and then an outlook for the future of those emissions. Some takeaways for this presentation are that there's relatively positive stories to be shared about our emissions. New Hampshire is currently emissions that are lower than the reduction pathway identified in the New Hampshire Climate Action Plan in 2009, and recently has been identified as a national and regional leader in economy-wide greenhouse gas reductions. Policies exist. We've experienced net benefits in public health and the environment, as well as the economy, as our greenhouse gas emissions have fallen. And while greenhouse gas emissions have fallen, our energy use, including retail electric sales, has remained steady over the last decade. And it's, in fact, projected to remain steady for the next decade. Absent additional policies, New Hampshire is likely to maintain a similar greenhouse gas emissions level for the foreseeable future. So when we look at emissions, we can include them from two broad classes. There's the traditional air pollutants, which include the 6 criteria air pollutants that were included in the Clean Air Act, as well as toxic air pollutants. These are relatively kind of short duration in the air, but they have a direct impact on public health and environmental quality. And they are regulated through a series of national and state regulations and laws. Greenhouse gas emissions can be both naturally occurring and man-made gases, but they have a more indirect impact on health and environmental quality by first warming the atmosphere, by trapping radiation near the Earth's surface. These gases are regulated more diffusely, if at all nationally, and among the states. When we look at those regulations and regulatory programs, what we can see is for the more traditional air pollutants, programs are far more diverse and numerous, and ranging from an acid rain program, diesel particulate matter program, the ozone program, to the air toxics program. And they include, rules and monitoring as well as enforcement activities. For the greenhouse gases, we are more limited to the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which I'll discuss at a little more length later, as well as New Hampshire's Renewable Portfolio Standard. These have a direct impact on greenhouse gas emissions in the state. Also have supporting work that is not specifically related to air pollutants and greenhouse gas programs, but is supportive of both efforts. And that is work that's being undertaken by various state agencies, energy efficiency, strategic electrification, and renewable energy. But when we just look at pollutants, we're going to focus on the greenhouse gas emissions, and we're going to exclude a discussion of the conventional pollutants. Even though it's worth noting that some of those pollutants, such as ozone and portions of the particulate matter, which can be described as black carbon, do have a short-lived climate impact. However, because New Hampshire's air quality improved so much, it is almost impossible to quantify these gases and particulate matter within the greenhouse gas inventory to any substantive degree. So we'll be focusing instead on carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and the man-made gases, hydrofluorocarbons and perfluorocarbons and sulfohexafluoride. There are, in fact, many other gases that could be included within this family of emissions, but for New Hampshire's inventory, these are the ones that predominate. We see them emerging is a few different sectors or types of activities. Principally, fossil fuel combustion is the largest source of those greenhouse gas emissions. Industrial processes, landfills and wastewater treatment, and agriculture and forestry provide a little bit as well. Now, with respect to the methodology for how we calculate the emissions that are occurring, is typically done around the nation, and we look at only the emissions that are occurring within our geographic boundaries. So with respect to energy, that means that we account for the primary fuel consumption. So that's the fuels that are burned to generate electricity, so natural gas or coal, heating within the building sector, which might be not natural gas, propane, or heating oil, or internal combustion engines in the transportation sector, whether it's diesel or motor gasoline. Kind of like bound ourselves by just looking at what's burned. What is not included are any emissions associated with the retail electric sales. We don't, no point do we look at how much electricity is purchased within the residential sector, the commercial sector, or the industrial sector and factor that into the emissions. We just focus on what is occurring within the individual electric generation facilities. Likewise, we also do not look at the emissions occurring outside the state from mining, drilling, or transporting energy to the state. Those emissions are captured within the inventories of other states in the nation as they are occurring within their boundaries. And similarly, do not look at the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the manufacture or production of materials outside the state, even if they are consumed in the state or disposed. So they are not counted. And these were points that were raised in the last commission meeting, and I just wanted to make sure that that was well understood. Likewise, we are measuring what is being emitted into the atmosphere, but we are not measuring what is in the atmosphere. But what we do see when we do the inventory, among the greenhouse gases that I've already identified, carbon dioxide far and away as the #1 greenhouse gas being emitted as a result of fossil fuel combustion, and it representing nearly 90% of our total greenhouse gas emissions. And that is even accounting for the fact that the other gases have a potential to absorb heat and trap it in the Earth's surface on a molecule per molecule basis. That's already been accounted for in this chart. But why this matters is that gases are long-lived and they accumulate in the atmosphere. And when we look at carbon dioxide, we don't monitor ambient air. Are being measured around the world. And here at the Mauna Loa Observatory, the most famous site that's been doing daily recordings since 1958 through present day, has documented a steady increase in carbon dioxide in the last 60 years. And what they've shown is this gradual increase, rising from just over 310 parts per million to just under 420 parts per million. So seeing, in just over 60 years, a greater than 100 parts per million increase in the atmosphere. Now, why that's important is because when we look over the past 100 years ago, or 800 on ice core data, which helps us understand what the carbon dioxide concentration over a much longer period of time is, we see that carbon dioxide levels, with the exception of a brief blip around 250,000 years ago, never exceeded 300 parts per million. It's ranged from about 300 parts per million to less than 200 parts per million as the Earth has exited various glacial periods. But until the Industrial Revolution, it hadn't broken that 300 part per million ceiling. And so what we see now is what was that gentle rise in comparison to the geologic record is a virtual, and it's well outside of that record at a level that has not been seen in about 3 million years. And so the most recent record was 417 parts per million set in May of this year, with the expectation that carbon dioxide levels will continue to rise in the foreseeable future, even in spite of any economic downturns that we may be seeing as a result of the COVID outbreak. And because these gases accumulate within the Earth's, as the greenhouse gases have risen, so too has the Earth's temperature, with the greatest increase happening since the 1970s. The two warmest years on record are 2016 and 2019. with some potential for 2020 to challenge one or both of them for their spots at the top. So what is New Hampshire's contribution to this global phenomenon of climate change and global warming? Well, we've been identified nationally and regionally as being a leader. And so this uses an analysis of economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions for 2005 through 2017 at the national level and 2005 through 2016 at the regional level. And in the study on the left-hand side, which is the national one, what they found was that our wide emissions between that time period fell by 37%, second only to Maryland, with Maine following at 33%. So here we are leading, other states that are traditionally lauded for their energy programs and their renewable programs. We are, a nationwide leader. Another analysis which looked at criteria reductions. So when you take the total emissions and you divide it by the population at a given point in time, and you compare that between 2005, which are the blue bars on the right-hand chart, and 2016, which is the olive bars on that same chart, what we see is that New Hampshire, between those two time periods, actually had a reduction very similar, 37% below. So between 2005 and 2016, its per capita emissions drops 37%, much more than the just over 27% that Maine and Mass saw. So even though our per capita emissions in 2005 were about average for the region and were as low as the lowest 2016, it was the significance of the drop between those two periods that allowed us to stand out. When we look just at New Hampshire's data for 1997 and 2018, for the economy, for our population, for our greenhouse gas emissions, and for our primary energy consumption, that's our energy consumption that does not include retail electricity, and it's the energy consumption that it's used to calculate our greenhouse gas emissions. We can see that a positive story remains. And this is, it's 97 forward because that's the only time period for which all of this data was available. But what we can see is when year after 1997 is compared to 1997, economy grew nearly continuously with a slight pause from 2006 to 2009 during the recession. But following 2009, it continued its rise, rising to 57% above 1997 levels over that time, well above the 13% increase in population over that time period. So while the population did rise, it wasn't the single driver behind the economy. We weren't just getting a larger economy because we had more people. Other factors were at play. And it wasn't because we were consuming more energy either. What we can see from the analysis of the primary energy and the greenhouse gas emissions is that for a short period of time, they followed economy, rising to nearly 30% increase over 1997 levels by 2004, but both fell. The primary energy 10% above 1997 levels by 2018, but the greenhouse gas levels, in fact, were % below 1997 levels by 2018. Demonstrates is that we can have an economy that gets stronger even as we become more efficient in our energy consumption and our greenhouse gas emissions decline. And this was a story was identified during the development of the 2009 Climate Action Plan by the 29-member Climate Change Policy Task Force. This body felt that actually pursuing actions in New Hampshire was an economic development plan for the state. And they made that point as such when they issued the report in March of 2009. But they also identified two aspirational greenhouse gas targets, 20% below 1990 levels by 2025 and an 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. And these targets were identified as they were consistent where climate scientists were telling us we needed to get the economy in order to support a stable climate for public health and for the global economy to the recommendations they're making today. One point we add in the slide is to note that the 20% reduction below 2025 is comparable to a 44% below 2005 levels by 2025. 2005 is continually referenced throughout this because it's the year that our emissions peaked, and it's also the year where that national and regional analysis was done. So here's a figure that where we first introduced what our greenhouse gas inventory has looked like between 1990 and 2018 for the entire economy. And these are the years for which it's available. And so you can see that there's that peak around 2004, 2005, but also includes is a projection that was done during the development of the Climate Action Plan by Dr. Wake's team at Climate Solutions New England, which projected what could occur to New Hampshire's emissions levels absent any changes in policy and any changes in the way that we consumed energy. And it found that we could expect nearly a doubling of greenhouse gas emissions between 2005 and 2050 if nothing were to occur. Second on this figure is a way that was identified by the Climate Policy Task Force. It includes, in addition to the 2020 target and the 2050 target, an interim target that they had selected for 2012. And so it provides a roadmap for what we would need to keep our emissions below in order to stay on a gradual and sustained reduction out to 2050 that was consistent with the science of the day. And what we can see here is that we are well below that business as usual projection that was established out to 2050, and that we are in fact beating the 2009 plan's pathway. However, when we remove the business as usual pathway and introduce a more recent projection, which included analysis done for the 2017 RGGI modeling and analysis that was done for the 2014 New Hampshire Energy Strategy. And these are what we find is that New Hampshire is now projected to continue to decline in emissions throughout 2020. So our most recent data is 2018. But that after 2020, we can expect our greenhouse gas emissions to be relatively flat and to cross that goal pathway at about 2024 and remain above it through 2030. But when we now compare our own emissions to that pathway, we actually seem to be exceeding it. But we'll get to these projections a little bit later. We wanted to kind of introduce that while we are seeing positive indications that New Hampshire is leading in terms of overall greenhouse gas emission reduction since 2005, there may be some trouble ahead. So when we dig into the individual greenhouse gas emissions and look at the sectors and their contributions, this one is where we break down the individual sectors into the electric sector, the transportation sector, electric sector in red, transportation sector in blue, residential in light blue, and industrial in gray. We do include waste and agriculture, but they present a small but relatively unchanging amount of the others. And so one of the things that we can see here is that between 1990 and 2004, 2005, was that ran pretty consistently out until 2017 and 2018. And it was principally driven by the electric sector. So while we've seen more than 30% reduction since 2004, 2005, sector emissions fell nearly 74% since the peak year. Other sectors declined through 2011, but they've remained relatively flat or even begun rising since 2011. However, when we look at New Hampshire's energy consumption by sector from 1990 to 2018, this changes things up. What we're not doing is we're not looking at greenhouse gas emissions anymore, and we're not looking at the electric sector as a single entity. Now we're looking at each individual energy consuming economy outside of electric sector, and we're incorporating retail electric sales. So how much electricity is being consumed by the residential sector, commercial and industrial is now being considered. And what this shows is that the New Hampshire economy, while greenhouse gas emissions have dropped, our energy consumption has been more of a steady state. Peak around 2004, 2005 after rising steadily from 90, but it declined about 2011 and then has begun rising slightly, but has not yet reached the peak that it did in 2004 at 250 trillion BTUs. This is going on here that is actually allowing our economy to increase in its total energy consumption, even if greenhouse gas emissions as a whole are dropping within the electric sector. And this emphasizes, these two pie charts just show the relative contribution of each sector in 2005, which was the peak year, and 2018 which is the most recent year. And here we can see that in 2005, the transportation sector represented just 3%, so about a third of the total emissions. The electric sector was slightly ahead of it at 35%, and the built environment with residential, commercial, and industrial was not yet 30% of the total during waste, but not kind of at the scale of the others. By 2018, the electric sector had contracted to represent just 13%, whereas the transportation sector had expanded to represent 45%. And the building sector now represented nearly 40% of the total emissions. So there had been kind of a fundamental shift in how greenhouse gas emissions were distributed among the various economic sectors in New Hampshire. Another way to look at this is to examine how each sector changed relative to itself, and then how each sector compared to that drop between 2005 and 2018. So we have left-hand side and bars on the right-hand side for each of the different sectors. The bars on the left-hand side, which are a darker shade of blue, and all kind of lower half of the x-axis refer to the change that each sector saw relative to itself between 2005 and 2018. And in each case, it shows that every single sector did see a reduction between 2005 and 2018. So we were seeing a decrease in overall greenhouse gas consumption in every single sector that we were inventorying. But when we look at what contribution that made to the total drop, what we find is that the electric sector was responsible for nearly 90% of the total reductions between 2005 and 2018, with the transportation sector providing just over 5.2%, and the building sector, when you aggregate residential, commercial, and industrial, providing about 5.7%. The electric sector is leading the way, and this has implications for our future emissions, which we'll get to nearer to the end. But when we explore the individual sectors, we do see that there are some positive stories buried within them. And unfortunately, we're limited to just a single slide to explain each of these. But what this slide tells us that because motor gasoline is the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector in New Hampshire, that means that passenger cars and light-duty trucks are the single biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions, with heavy-duty vehicles that use diesel fuel or diesel trucks, pickup trucks representing a smaller share of the total greenhouse gas emissions. But what we can see is, again, emissions rose between 1990 and the beginning of the 21st century, but then have decreased out to 2011 and then have slowly risen since that time. But what's important to remember is that New Hampshire remains a relatively rural state in many aspects, and we have been seeing population growth across this time. So our reductions were not because people were giving up cars and driving less. We, in fact, saw more cars on the road. We saw more vehicle miles traveled occurring in each of the years that are shown here. But what is most likely the case is that the cars were becoming more efficient, meaning the cars in general were getting more miles per gallon of both gas and diesel purchased. And so this had the influence of offsetting the rise in VMT and the rise in the population that we might have seen. So even though it's relatively flat here, this shows that per mile traveled and per person in the state, we are reducing less oxide and other greenhouse gases in the transportation sector. However, we are not seeing any signal that the transportation sector is headed downward, which is what we would need to do in order to be consistent with decarbonization of the economy. The residential sector shows a little bit more flexibility in terms of the residential greenhouse gas emissions did rise until about 2004, 2005, but then began to slide through 2011. Now, some of this may have been due to less energy as a result of the recession, but some of it may have also been flexibility to switch from a higher cost and oil or even wood pellets, which are not documented within this inventory because we treat wood as carbon neutral. But since 2011, we've seen an increase in both home heating oil as well as propane gas, which is the more olive color, as a result of both population growth and the rebound of the economy. Fuel prices drop, that also relaxes the pressure to continue to maybe rely on cordwood. In the commercial sector, while we've seen the economy grow, we did not see the greenhouse gas emissions necessarily rise. And so what we've got here is we've actually seen greenhouse gas emissions go down a little bit and may be relatively stable, but that may be due to the fact that heating oil and residential or residual fuel oil took up less of a share of the total emissions within this sector and were instead displaced by natural gas, which is in the light blue at the top, and the olive propane, which is in the middle. Those two gases emit less carbon dioxide per unit of energy delivered and are more cost effective. So as businesses, commercial entities switched over to using them, emitting less carbon per energy delivered further to from. The industrial sector, much different profile because it was the one sector where non-combustion gases, dominant source of greenhouse gas emissions. Here we can see that those rose from about 1990 through the 21st century and then have been continued to rise through to present day. We can also see is that natural gas did rise as well, and that residual fuel oil almost non-existent. So we saw the heaviest emitter fuel decline and then almost disappear, and that's allowed this sector to get cleaner. Possibly it was coming from being displaced by natural gas. But when we look at just the electric sector, this is where we've got the story to tell about our greenhouse gas emission reductions. And this can be told in part by looking at what happened to all of the fuels since 2003, 2004, 2005. So between 1990 and about 2002, coal and residual oil were the dominant sources of power generation in the state. And in 2002, 2 natural gas facilities opened, and that created a significant spike in generation to 2004, 2005. It didn't fully explain everything because if you look, coal also had risen a little bit during that period. But since 2004 and 2005, residual fuel has declined precipitously and is not a significant amount of the contribution from the electric sector. But the coal sector dropped off quite quickly, and it's still present, but running at a fraction of where it had been in previous decades. But even the natural gas sector, which has displaced a lot of those 2 energy sources, in part because it's cost effective and cheaper to run, and it emits half as much CO2 per unit of energy hour of electricity produced compared to coal. Too has been seeing a decrease in emissions between 2015 and 2018. When we look at the entire electric sector for New Hampshire, this again changes, moving away from greenhouse gas emissions to looking at total annual generation. Instead of million metric tons, now we're talking about gigawatt hours of electricity generated in the state. We can see that there's for New Hampshire's entire electric fleet changed in 2002 with the introduction of natural gas. The other thing to kind of be added in since that time is a small amount of wind, but that everything else is kind of, once residual fuel oil disappeared, everything else has remained. But it from here is that total generation in New Hampshire has been declining, and the sources that tend to run all the time have maintained relatively stable amounts of energy that they are generating. And so that's the nuclear facility, the biomass facility, the hydroelectric facilities, as well as the wind facilities. They were producing a steady amount of energy, but as the electricity generated in the state declined, that put downward pressure on the fuel facilities to operate. When we investigate what is the cause of that and what is therefore the cause of greenhouse gas emissions declining in New Hampshire, because the electric sector is responsible for 90% of the total reductions, we can find 2 regional explanations for this. One is that we participate in RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. It's a 10-state cooperative effort to cap CO2 levels and gradually bring that amount of CO2 emitted by the electric sector down. And this has been shown to have positive public health and environmental benefits in addition to the greenhouse gas benefits. And it does this because each facility that emits carbon dioxide into the atmosphere has to purchase 1 allowance for every ton of CO2 emitted into the air. Allowances generate revenue, which states can use to invest in energy efficiency and renewable energy, which can then put a continued downward on the need for fossil fuel plants to be running at all, but they can also take those revenues and invest them in other consumer benefit programs. So the program is really providing an economic signal to generators in the region to run more, or if they're non-emitting, whereas facilities that have a much higher carbon per unit of electricity generated, more costly for them to run. But it provides opportunities for the state to invest in energy efficiency and renewable energy and therefore decrease as for everyone. But there's also another factor. New Hampshire's electric generators are not just providing electricity to New Hampshire users. They are in fact participating in the ISO New England market. So ISO New England is a nonprofit that is charged with making sure that we have reliable, cost-effective electricity today, tomorrow, and now. And so the electricity that's being generated in New Hampshire would possibly continue to be generated and sold to the surrounding New England states, even if each and every single electric user in New Hampshire were to unplug and turn things off today. And so that's important to note, is that we could continue to have greenhouse gas emissions from the electric sector, even if we were to use no electrical energy in the state, because our generators participate in this regional market. That also means that what happens in New England has an impact on our energy consumption. And so this is where we can introduce a somewhat complicated figure that introduces two ways in which the region is influencing New Hampshire's generators. And it's influencing both the demand electrical, also influencing the total amount of electricity that's consumed. So peak demand is the green bar chart, and it's got the axis on the left-hand side, and the total annual energy consumption, which is in gigawatt hours, is got the y-axis on the right-hand side. But what we can see from both is that the bar chart and the line are both decreasing, and they've been decreasing from about 2005, 2006 time period. So when New Hampshire saw that peak in greenhouse gas emissions, but we also saw our peak in total generation, the region saw its peak as well. And since that time, we've been using less and less electricity within the New England region. So as the New England users uses less electricity, there's less call for our generators to provide the region with power. And this has had downward pressure for the gas emitting facilities that are coal and natural gas to run less frequently. One of the other things that's also had an impact on coal and our oil and our residual oil facilities, which are still present, is that the peak demand days have been going down. Peak demand, those days when the greatest call for electric generation during a specific set of hours during the day, typically it occurs during the summer, and that's as a result of being like a very warm day. People get home, they turn on their AC, but at the same time, they're also cooking dinner, doing dishes, running. With all their appliances on, there's a spike in the need for electricity. And so ISO New England doesn't just use the low emitting plants and the nuclear facility that might be running constantly, but it now calls upon coal facilities, the residual oil burning facilities, and the oil plants that only run a very limited number of per year, but they also are responsible for a lot of greenhouse gas emissions when they are running. As the peaks go down on any given day, and that highest peak during the year goes down, there's less and less of a need for those facilities to be running, either during any given day or throughout the course of an entire year. And as they run less often, they emit less. And so total emissions go down within New Hampshire and within the region. So by the peak going down and generation going down, this puts a downward pressure on our own emissions here in New Hampshire. So where we see the change in retail electric sales, which is affecting New Hampshire generators, is in the New England states. And here we've got two different sets of charts. Again, looking at bar charts. On the left-hand side, we have an analysis of how electric retail sales across the entire economy in each of the New England states changed from 1990 to 2018. So kind of the whole scope of when we would have done greenhouse gas emissions inventory, but then also from that peak year, 2005 to 2018, the time period through which we've seen an analysis kind of conducted throughout in our own study, but also in the national and the regional study. What we see is for the longer data set, from 1990 to 2018, the state increased its overall electrical retail sales. New Hampshire led the way with a 23% increase over that time frame. But when we look at 2005 to 2018, every state, with the exception of Maine, did see a decrease in the total retail electric sales. So they were consuming more for across 2090 to 2018. From 2005 down, they were consuming less. However, New Hampshire was behind its peers in that it only reduced 2% across that time period, where Rhode Island and Vermont reduced at least 6%, and they were the next closest in order to us. So the region is using less electricity in general, and it's primarily being driven by states around us. And looking forward, what's ISO New England, because they look out into the future, they continue to note that with the exception of Maine, for energy efficiency, will largely us. So when we look at our share of the demand, the peak demand, that highest amount of electricity used on a specific day during the year, our demand growth is not expected to go up or down. But for all the other states, with the exception of Maine, the rate of growth in peak demand is expected to actually decline. So they are expected to get slightly more efficient than we are going out into a decade. Look at renewable energy. It's the chart on the right-hand side. See from an analysis of the renewable portfolio standards in each of the different states is that New Hampshire is not expected to be anywhere near by 2035, 2040 in terms of the deployment of new renewable energy. And so states will be continuing to put a downward pressure on the fossil generators in the region and in New Hampshire to run. So we're expected to have a relatively flat ART for the foreseeable future. So in terms of the deployment of renewable energy being about where we are in 2025 and keeping that goal forward, other states will continue to push for more and more renewables. This will then put more pressure for our greenhouse gas emissions in the electric sector to go down. When we look at the rate modeling route, figure shows historical electric sector emissions in red, 90 through 2019. 2019, where all the other data is for 2018 because we do have access to some RGGI data. The other data is coming from the Department of Energy. But when we look at the modeling, 17 modeling, what it suggests is that in the 2020s, we could actually have emissions from the electric sector that is lower than that of our waste sector. And it's below 1 million metric tons. So it's a considerable drop. But what we do see is through 2030, it flatlines and we can't depend on the electric sector to continue to push our emissions downward. In fact, when we look at the 2014 to see through 2030, based on the analysis for the 2014 New Hampshire Energy Strategy, it's projected that the transportation sector will be relatively flat. And in fact, our historical emissions are slightly above that. When we look at the residential sector and the other environment, the 2014 analysis suggested that we would actually see a growth in emissions between now and 2030. And in all cases, for residential, commercial, and industrial, what we see is that current emissions are consistent with where we were projected to be as of 2020. When we aggregate all of these different analyses, the RGGI analysis and that 2014 analysis, we're given this red profile, which you've already seen, and it shows that we may not be able to expect to see any more reductions absent policies, and that we will in fact have a flat line and cross the goal pathway identified in the climate plan at around 2024 and maintain level through 2030. And in fact, our emissions at this point are outside of where we had been projected to be now. The black line is kind of headed, red line is headed south. So to wrap up, just takeaways that we've already identified is that New Hampshire is currently been identified in the Climate Action Plan in 2000. And this is where policies exist. We have experienced a net benefit across the economy and in terms of public health as those emissions have fallen. But our energy use lags that of our neighbors, and it is expected to remain steady over. So, absent any additional policies and work, we can expect that our greenhouse gas emissions will not fall in the foreseeable future. I'll put up my contact information, and I will note that if anyone has any interest, please feel free to contact me. I'd be more than happy to go through this in more detail than I've already done. The best way to contact me is my email, which we are currently working remotely. I look forward to your questions, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think we can exit out of the presentations. My name is Andrew Preventure. I'm with BFresh Consulting. I've been tasked with helping to coordinate the goals of this commission. I wanted to first kind of start off tonight's meeting with just a quick review of kind of the scope that our commission is working towards. This bipartisan commission is tasked with developing a report that identifies science-based emission reduction goals for the state to achieve by 2050. This goal of the commission is rather narrow in scope. The final report is hoping to include some sort of interim goals for emission reductions in 2030, 2040 that would be necessary to meet the 2050 goal. Just reminding that this is a lot of information. It's a really large subject matter. There's a lot of information that we've already covered and we'll continue to cover. There's different things that have been discussed through some of the commission emails and on the documents that are presented in regards to some potential solutions and whatnot. But I think the scope of this commission and the time frame in which it's been set out for is really kind of laser focused on working to develop these science-based reduction goals for the state to achieve. We're going to start off tonight with a kind of roll call of sorts for attendance, and we'll also be asking folks in a little bit of an introduction period to see if you could let us know what your favorite outdoor spot is in New Hampshire. We're starting like a couple minutes early, so I'm sure there'll be a few folks who are going to be adding on as we go, but I'm sure by the time it hits 7 o'clock, we will have at least some of our introductions and leave plenty of time for discussion. So I'm going to start with, let's see, Senator Tom Sherman.
Hi, everyone. It's Senator Tom Sherman, and I am in Rye. Are we supposed to give you our favorite spot now?
Favorite outdoor spot in New Hampshire.
Well, my favorite outdoor spot is out at the end of Harbor Road, right by the jetty in Rye. If you haven't sat out there on the jetties, did life while at the islands, you're missing something. So come on over and I'll show it to you.
Next, we have Senator David Waters.
Hi, Senator David Waters in Dover. And, I'm just going to say the woods, anywhere, take me out in the woods. Dover's on the Cocheco or up north, you name it, the woods.
Next, we have Representative Dave Danielson. Representative, I think you might be on mute. Let me, I can. Logging back on, but I do see him there, so we'll mark him down as present. Next, we have Representative Kat McGee.
Yes, good evening, everyone. I have a new favorite place. My husband and I just had an anniversary and we went away to Holderness to an inn that we had stayed at many years ago. And we took a hike up West Rattlesnake to the old bridle path where you can see all of the islands of Swan Lake. It was beautiful. So, and it's a really easy trail, but for a great payoff. So I would recommend that.
Wonderful. Representative Danielson, would you like to say your favorite outdoor spot?
It would have to be the rivers. I don't know if can you hear me now?
Yes, you're perfect.
Yeah, excellent. So I like the Merrimack. It's been my favorite since I was a kid, so it still is. It's a favorite place to be. I'd love to watch the falls. It's great.
Wonderful. Representative Gary Woods.
Yes, my favorite spot is off the coast, being a sailor. I love sailing up and down the coast and seeing all the little gunk holes, Isle of Shoals and environs.
Wonderful. Our next person we have tonight is Joanne Aschheim from the New Hampshire Public Health Association. Today, there's an alternate. It's JJ Smith. Welcome, JJ. Favorite outdoor spot?
Hi, I'm Dr. JJ Smith. I'm the public policy advocate for the Public Health Association, and Joanne's on vacation, and I hope she's enjoying that thoroughly. My favorite spot, I don't have a single one, but anywhere on the Seacoast, because I grew up on Seacoast. I don't live there anymore, but getting there is always special.
Wonderful. Next, we have Clifton Below from the New Hampshire Municipal Association and the town of Claremont.
No, City of Lebanon,
Excuse me.
Assistant Mayor. Excuse me. I guess my backyard's one of my favorite spots, but also the city's conservation lands, the forests within walking distance, in Boston Lot Lake.
Wonderful. We have Dan Bennett from the New Hampshire Auto Dealers. Dan, I see you on there. You're on mute.
Good evening, everybody. Hands down, my favorite spot's going to be Cannon Mountain. So most weekends in the winter, you'll find my two boys and my wife skiing there, and winter's not long enough.
We have next Catherine Bork from Unitil. Not sure if I saw her on yet.
Andrew, I was just texting with her. She said she was having some trouble with connectivity.
Awesome. We'll get out another invite for her. Zach Conway from Dartmouth Hitchcock. I know Zach had called in last time, so if he is available, we'd love to hear your outdoor spot. If not, if you're on the phone number and you want to shoot us an email, we can kind of elevate you. Next, we'll have, was that somebody? Oh, all right. Next, we have David Career from the Business and Industry Association.
Hey, any ski slope would be good for me.
Dr. Michael Dow from the New Hampshire Medical Society.
Hi there. Actually, it is Michael Doe, but a lot of people do say Dow, so that's okay. I'm sitting here in Guilford, looking out at Gunstock and Belknap Mountain. I love the Belknap. Gunstock changes color every night when the sun sets and kind of makes its own weather with the clouds going over it. So that and Lake Winnipesaukee.
Beautiful. Michael Fitzgerald, Department of Environmental Services. Mike?
Yep, now I'm unmuted. Good evening, everyone. I'm Assistant Director at the Department of the Air Division at the Department of Environmental Services. I'm an avid boater, and so I'm going to say Lakes Opeechee and Winnisquam and up near Laconia and Great Bay are all favorite spots of mine.
Wonderful. Donna Gamache, Eversource.
Good evening, Donna Gamache with Eversource. I'm probably not like everybody else. My absolute all-time favorite place is the Flume. It's historic, it's ancient, and it's gorgeous. Thank you.
Absolutely. For representing Mayor George Hansel tonight, we have the alternative Mary Bruner. Mary?
Hi, everyone. Mary Brunner here, sitting at my home in Keene. And one of my favorite spots is Granite Lake in Munsonville. It's just a beautiful, beautiful lake. And there's a little island out in the middle that you can go to and jump off the rocks into the water. And this is my favorite spot.
Next, we have Tom Irwin, Conservation Law Foundation.
Good evening. Tom Irwin. I direct the New Hampshire office of CLF. We are lucky to have so many choices. It's hard to choose one, but I guess for now I'll say Odiorn.
Next on my list is Matthew Mayu from the Office of Strategic Initiatives. Matt said he was available for the prior presentations, but he wasn't going to be able to attend this second half. So he was able to watch our presentations though. We also have Madeline Minot from Clean Energy New Hampshire.
Hello. I'll say that my favorite outdoor spot is Lafayette Ridge, which is a popular one, but it's my favorite because that's where I got engaged in the middle of a crazy storm.
Paula Minahan from the New Hampshire Hospital Association will be unable to attend tonight. Next we have Huck Montgomery, Liberty Utilities.
Hey, everybody. I'm going to go with Lake Mascoma in Lebanon and Enfield, where my family has a place. It's the balcony from my mother-in-law's lake house, looking out over that sunset is it's literally world class. It's not a better spot that I could think of.
Wonderful. Next, we have Jim O'Brien from the Nature Conservancy, New Hampshire.
Hi, everyone. I guess my favorite spot would have to be a small island on Lake Umbagog that we camp on. That's just a great place to be.
Michelle Roberge from the New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services.
Good evening, everyone. My favorite spot, I would have to say this time of year, would be kayaking on Swan Lake.
Next, we have Dennis Sasseville from Worthern Industries.
Yeah, good evening. I'd say probably any time of year except dead of winter would be the lawn of Church Landing in Meredith, watching boats go by.
Roger Stevenson, Union of Concerned Scientists.
Good evening, everyone. I think it's too many to think about, but I think for I could reach into the back of my brain and say the Bowl Research Natural Area on the southern edge of the White Mountain National Forest.
Beautiful. We have Cameron Wake from the University of New Hampshire.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. I'm going to split it up, summer and winter. I'm going to agree with Tom Irwin on Odiorn Point, but only if you get there by boat to the special beaches that you have. And in winter, any pond that's still frozen in New Hampshire that I can go skating on, including Meredith Bay in the depth of winter when there's a pond hockey classic.
Next, we'll have Rob Warner from League of Conservation Voters.
So Rob said that he had to hop off, but he is going to be joining us again shortly.
Wonderful. Colleen Vane from Timberland.
Hey everyone, yeah, Colleen Vian, Sustainability Director for Timberland. I will have to say there's so many different spots, but I'm more of a summer person and water person than I am a ski person. So two top of the mind would be Mount Major, and getting my young kids out there to hike all the way up to the top has been awesome. And then also Merry Meeting Lake and Lake Winnipesaukee.
Our next member is Chris Kelly from the NAACP of Greater Manchester. For an alternate tonight, we have Arnold Micolo.
Arnold Micolo with NAACP and CLF. I'll say my two favorite would be Osceola and Unkanunuk Ghost Town.
And we have Michael Licata, New Hampshire Electric Co-op.
Good evening, everyone. I'd have to say my favorite spot is jumping on the rocks along the Pemi with the family. We always have a good time doing that in the summer.
And the last person I have here, Senator Jeb Bradley. Senator Bradley in? All right, so we will kind of move on to our next pieces here. Just for the folks who are online and watching, we have a couple things I just want to direct you to. On the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A area. If you have some questions that you'd like to post and you think of during the meeting, feel free to post those there, and we'll be able to hopefully answer them. At the end of this meeting, there will be a public comment period where you'll be able to submit some questions or raise your hand, and we'll allow you to ask a question. We've been fortunate enough tonight to have some great presentations from Kathleen Bush and Chris Gogland, and they both are also willing to, they're currently on as panelists right now. And additionally, as a panelist is Matt Cahaleen, who's a program manager for DHHS in their climate and health program. So we have a couple folks who are available for some questions tonight. I will kind of pass it over to the chair, Senator Sherman, to guide us through the discussion of these presentations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and hi, everyone. Tonight, really, what I just want to give a brief introduction. We're talking about looking at what I'd like to do for a second is just look at globally how we're moving forward with the commission. And so when we think about these presentations, and there will be another series of presentations in October, we should always keep at the forefront of our thoughts the goal, which is to identify that reduction target or the reduction goal that we are looking for to come out of this emission commission. So there are so many topics. My sister is one of the world's experts on hydrofluorocarbons. She's offered to come and speak to us, and so we could go off in all different kinds of tangents, but we need to keep that focus, the laser focus on setting that goal and coming up with that goal that we think is reasonable from all the different perspectives that are represented in this commission. So with that said, what I'd like to do is open the floor, maybe start with Dr. Bush and her presentation and how and whether or not there are any questions for Dr. Bush regarding her presentation. The best way to do this is to have people raise their hand through the participant or the chat. Does everybody know how to do that? If you click on participants and you'll see at the bottom raise hand, and maybe Andrew, you could help.
Absolutely.
It doesn't look like we have any questions for Katie. Oh, yes, we do. Cameron.
If we actually got globally to carbon neutral, so if we got to net zero emissions by 2050, which is what the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 1.5 degree Celsius report has called for, what that might mean for public health in New Hampshire. I'm not necessarily looking for the definitive answer, but I'm wondering if you've begun to sort of think about that world where we were really able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to keep us below 1.5 degrees Celsius warming.
Yeah, that's a great question, Cameron. It's good to see you. I can't answer that specifically. I think I tried in my presentation to outline that we certainly know there are direct benefits from air pollutants, and then these indirect benefits by helping to stabilize temperature. I also tried to quantify what some of that risk looks like. So we're talking about definitely reducing the risk of certain hospitalizations and deaths if we can stabilize that temperature. And so I can't right now off the top of my head think about what a carbon neutral, maintaining just a 1 or 2 degree increase means in terms of kind of days over 90, days over 95, days over 100. But if you just think about it broadly in terms of stabilizing temperature, there will definitely be direct benefits and indirect benefits. And that publication that I cited, they did go on to quantify and monetize some of those benefits, particularly to children's health. And we're talking, millions of dollars saved by reducing these cases of asthma and other related health outcomes. So there's not only a public health benefit, but an economic benefit. But I think that is great, sort of, a good seed to really try to quantify some of that going forward.
Thanks, Katie.
Are there any other questions for Dr. Bush? Tom Irwin.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you very much for your presentation, Dr. Bush. I have a question about what you would project in terms of health equity or health inequity impacts on some of the trajectories you laid out for an increasing number of severe heat days.
Yeah, sure. We haven't done a specific analysis, but I think we know sort of nationally, certainly internationally, that climate change exacerbates already existing health inequities. And so where we see higher rates of poor health outcomes, we can expect those to get worse under future climate scenarios. I think maybe thinking of the urban heat island as one example, and who lives in our urban areas, the social determinants of health that we know perhaps drive certain poor health outcomes, things like education rates, employment rates, access to resources. So I think just as a general understanding, we know that climate change will exacerbate those already existing health inequities.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Dr. Bush, I just had a question. You and I have worked on many commissions together, and I've interested in what you just said about social determinants of health. Is there a way you could briefly describe that, or just to make sure people really have a clear picture of how that would impact, especially with New Hampshire having, it's not the most diverse state in the world, but we do have some very rural communities and some very, or fairly urban communities such as Manchester. What would be an impact of setting climate goals in terms of the health of those two different, very different communities?
Well, I invite Chris or also Matt to sort of jump in here, but one example, I'm trying to tie it maybe to Chris's presentation as well, but if we continue to see improvements, say in the transportation sector, then we know that our urban corridors and transportation corridors would see a reduction in air pollutants, air emissions, greenhouse gases. And we know that certain neighborhoods are more likely to live near transportation corridors where we have increased levels of traffic-related pollutants, all air emissions, some greenhouse gases. And so certain people live near busy roads, right? Certain people with certain social determinants of health. That's one example. By reducing air emissions, traffic-related emissions specifically, maybe we would then improve air quality in those neighborhoods. When we say social determinants, what we really mean is that there are social factors, like I said, things like racial diversity, economic diversity, access to resources, that impact our ability to access healthcare and services that can impact our health outcome over our lifetime.
Right.
So that's maybe one example. In an urban area, in a more rural area, it's a little bit more challenging to think about. If anyone has an example off the top of their head, yeah, no, but it's a great question. I hope that my example at least shed some light on what we mean there.
That's great, thank you. And Representative Woods, I think you had a question.
Yeah, sorry, my computer blinked out for some reason, and it just came back on. Given the numbers that we have and looking at a goal for New Hampshire, even if we meet those goals, we're a pocket in the rest of the world. What are the implications? I mean, if we have a goal and we meet all of those in terms of energy usage, have you put that with the IPCC projections?
Chris, are you on the line? I think that is maybe more of
yeah. So I think this is sorry. I apologize. My computer has turned on and off 3 times since I wrapped up. So I hope no other questions have come through. Yes, New Hampshire is very small in comparison to the contribution that occurs within the entire globe. But New Hampshire participates in the regional greenhouse gas initiative. And because we participate in that, the region as a whole is able to function more effectively to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions through the RGGI program. And so that's kind of one example where even though we are one piece, we're part of a regional economy. New Hampshire also participates in the New England Governors and Eastern Canadian Premiers Conference, and it's made up of 11 states and provinces, the 5 New England Eastern provinces, and that economy there is roughly equivalent to the size of South Korea. And they have worked over the past nearly 2 decades, being the first group to come out with a strong statement on climate that was in agreement with the climate science, saying that we needed to get down to about 80% reduction by 2050. That region, the governors and premiers at the time established targets, and that paved the way for all of the states and provinces to establish climate plans. Much of those plans are now being translated into policy around us, and that's where we see New Hampshire benefiting in our own greenhouse gas emissions from that original work, which New Hampshire was part of. So yes, even though we may be a small part, we do participate in a larger economy, and the actions we take can be used as model for what other states in the nation and even other countries do. Because really, the only way we can achieve the targets that the IPC has identified, and that I believe we'll be talking about at the next meeting, is if the entire world works in concert together. And so kind of the reductions that we have seen in the electric sector are evidence of the success of kind of that collaborative effort and the potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you, Chris. I think Representative Danielson had a question.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, and good to see you.
Good to see you.
My question was, I actually have two questions. The first one was when Southern New Hampshire and Public Service New Hampshire put in the tower, the scrubber for the facility down here, one of the hopes was that asthma would be affected, and so that we'd lower particularly in children, we'd lower the occurrences of asthma in children. I've not ever been able to find out what have been the results. Have we seen lower occurrences? That was one question. And the second question was relative to mental health. I'm curious about what the tie-in is between the environment and mental health. And can we document that? Thanks, Tom.
Dr. Bush, can you answer?
Take a stab at, well, I can certainly say that I can go back and ask the asthma program about, sort of any temporal sort of, over time analysis of asthma. I think we saw in some of the data I shared that we continue to be really high. I think we've historically been high. That was adult asthma data I was showing. I'm not exactly sure about the rates in children, but I think it is important to just keep in mind that there are a lot of factors that can contribute to childhood asthma and lots of different triggers. And a big component of asthma is actually our ability to manage it once we have it and access to the medical care and medicines that we know will help manage asthma. So I guess just to say that that's a complex story when we're talking about children with asthma. Certainly reducing air emissions in the nearby vicinity would be helpful, but I think that's a tricky type of attribution study to do. But I can go back and ask if anyone has historical data like that. To your broader question around mental health, I think we could just look at the recent hurricanes hitting the coast and the Gulf. And I think there is stress associated with natural disasters that can be attributed to climate change. I think there is a lot of evidence to suggest just that the more stress we are under, whether it's climate related or otherwise economic, social stress, can lead to poor health outcomes. So I think natural disasters and their relationship to changing climate scenarios is one good example. I will say that Matt Callahan and I have worked for about 5 years together on the climate and health program, and we do find that this is a difficult piece to quantify because the reality is we don't have great data on mental health outcomes, and so it can be difficult then to put actual numbers or percentages to this. But I think anecdotally we know that there is absolutely an impact from climate-related disasters. Even on a hot day, right, we do see spikes in certain hospitalizations. I think there's evidence to suggest spikes in crime on hot days. So certainly these acute climate days, sort of extreme days, but then these other natural disasters that may, in the large scale, be associated with changing climate can have impacts on mental health. And it's tricky in this format, but there's a lot of experts on here, so I welcome other people to please share their
I'll jump in for a second on the climate. Actually, there's some really interesting work done by a guy named Richard Louv, L-O-U-V, on moving our population indoors and mental health. And he started a group called CN and N, or Children in Nature Network, which you can find on the web. But they've done some fascinating studies on mental illness and the movement of people indoors. And there is clearly a strong association between natural light, being outdoors, enjoying the outdoors. And when we think of climate and greenhouse gases and driving people more indoors because of hotter days, hotter weather, more extreme weather, there is a direct impact with that movement indoors. So there is some very interesting medical literature on that impact. I don't think it particularly relates to emissions, but it does have that indirect effect of moving people indoors. Senator Waters, you had a question, I think?
Yes, thank you, Tom. And thanks to Dr. Bush for the great presentation. On the mental health question, to kind of follow up on Representative Danielson, I think it would be helpful for us to think not just of the urban areas, that we also need to think of the North Country. And because if we substantially lose the winter season, and that means a lot of job loss in the ski and recreation industries and other impacts on logging, and if we have tree die-off and insect infestations moving up north, which they're already doing now, I guess that I wonder what she may know of any investigations of this sense of landscape loss. I think there's been some among the Inuit and North Slope Alaskan indigenous people, but also down in the Delta area, some of the areas that have been evacuated because of coastal retreat. And so I just think there are some studies out there. I hadn't really thought to try to do some looking for that. But, if we anticipate what is going to happen for North Country, those kinds of dramatic impacts will certainly have some mental health impact as well. Thanks.
Are there any other questions for Dr. Bush? Oh yeah, there's several. Here we go. Or any other questions. They don't have to be particularly for Dr. Bush. They can also be for Chris. Going down my list, I have JJ Smith next.
Hi, I wanted to circle back to something that Representative Gary Woods was saying. And that is that, in my experience of working to advocate with Science, Technology, and Energy in the House and the Energy, Natural Resources Committee in the Senate, there's always this pushback that we are 1.3 million approximately out of a world population of well over 7 billion. And our impact on greenhouse gas is going to be minuscule. And that's true. And so, I've always kind of tended to circle back, and I wonder whether this commission should actually focus more on how do we reduce all of the pollutants. It will inevitably reduce the greenhouse gases if we do that. And, we need to work, yes, to set examples, to be part of the solution on greenhouse gases, but there's so much that can still be done, especially transportation and building sectors, with energy efficiency and with electrification, both of heating and of the transportation sector, and getting rid of diesel wherever we can. There's so much that can be done to reduce emissions that are harmful, especially in areas where there's high traffic flow and places where there are poorer pockets of population who are subjected to all of that. And I guess I wonder whether really the greenhouse gas reduction goal is the most important goal.
Thank you. Now, was that maybe Chris could address that? Chris, you want to?
Just mostly making a comment rather than asking
All
a
right.
question.
Well, it was a question, and I think the goal of the commission, and this gets back to what I said at the beginning, which is the goal of the commission is to be able to set those goals for greenhouse gas for emission reduction. And today's talks, in my mind, were setting the stage for why that's an imperative. And I think, having heard from Dr. Bush on the health imperative and hearing from Chris, the concern I have from what Chris said is we can be very bold in our setting these emission reductions goals, but there's a reality that on our current trajectory, we're not going to meet those goals that were set in 2009. So there's a reality check there. Let's go to Representative Kat McGee for a question.
Yes, thank you, Senator. Well, I think my comment, my question goes along with what you're discussing right now, which my question was basically that I'm on science, technology, and energy. And to Chris's point when he made his presentation, the trajectory that we're on is not going to take us down where we would like to be going on that golden path without changes in policy. And in the past session, we had policies on every sector. You know, we're trying to make strides in terms of New Hampshire's policies. And even though we're only a small portion of the folks in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and we're only a very infinitesimal portion of the global emissions economy, I think where we're at is that everyone that is responsible for any energy economy has to be doing everything they can to contribute to the overall solution. I think that's where the responsibility comes in as a state. And so my question is, if we set these targets, just like in 2012 they set targets, how do we make them real or stick, or how do we translate them into policy to say, we now have to do these things, because if not, we won't meet our target? You know, like, how do we tie it together so that it actually has some teeth for us to enact the policies that will actually create the path that we're looking for? It's a big question, but.
That is a big question.
Senator Sherman, could I take a crack at that?
Absolutely.
Sure. Thank you very much. I think a couple of things in response to J.J. Smith's comments. I think that, as Chris pointed out very, very well, I thought, the pollutants, the conventional air pollutants, are short-term concerns, and we do need to make reductions, and I certainly agree that reductions in those will make reductions in greenhouse gases. But the greenhouse gas issue is one that is it's a much bigger picture, and as Representative McGee rightly points out, our impact may not be that great because we're a relatively small percentage, but I think we have to look at our as Chris shared, we have to look at our emissions in light of the region and what we can do as a contributor in the region. And I think to some degree it's a matter of equity, that everybody takes a haircut at the same time, and that we do these things and take a look at them and look, kind of find the areas where we can make the greatest reductions, but also with how we can do it synergistically with the region, where, you know, the RGGI region is one of the top 10 economies in the world. So I think we have to sort of look, you know, both short-term and long-term for conventional versus greenhouse gas emissions, although the long term on greenhouse gas is getting shorter all the time. We're getting closer to 2050. It seems to be coming faster and faster. But we also we need to do that perspective, as Chris mentioned, of the RGGI region, you know, 9, 10, 11 states, or the NEGECP, how we can work with our neighbors. And it's just a matter of us taking a look and seeing what we can do, how we can do it in an equitable manner with all our neighbors.
Thank you, Mike. You tweaked brain cell in my mind about, I'm not sure if this was what you were saying directly or indirectly, but we're part of a region, and failure to act as a state will have not just impact on greenhouse gases, but also fiscal impact on us as a state. And I think that's something to keep in the back of our minds. And there's really, as I understand it, I think some of you understand this much better than I do. There's a fiscal impact just in the cost of energy, but there's also fiscal impact, and this is what I understand the best, and I think Dr. Bush would too, is there's a clear fiscal impact in terms of the cost of healthcare. And one of the focuses or foci of this commission is really thinking about setting that goal from a public health standpoint. And there are all sorts of direct and indirect impacts of reaching a goal like a 2050 greenhouse gas emission reduction on public health. But one of the other sides of this is that getting to that point is has a huge fiscal impact in terms of the cost of healthcare and the human cost of not reaching that goal. So Huck Montgomery, you're next on my list of questions.
Yeah, so probably more for Chris. Just thinking about how we're going to measure emissions from the electricity sector for end use purposes. We're obviously looking at the retail electricity sales, and I'm just wondering if you have sort of a theory, Chris, on the best way to do that. And there's different methodologies, but what are your thoughts on how best to measure emissions from the electricity that we use in the state as opposed to the electricity that we generate in the state? Because I tend to think that the New Hampshire-based power generating sort of fleet is kind of neither here nor there, and it's really about the electricity that we consume in the state. That's really the thing that we're trying to look at. How do you see that, Chris?
So what you're getting at is there's the methodology that I described is referred to as site-based greenhouse gas inventorying. And so it's measuring the emissions that are occurring at a particular site. So, but there's also source-based, which is more holistic. It doesn't look outside our geographic boundaries necessarily to look at everything, but it could be expansive enough so that we start to look at the retail electric sales. And Massachusetts has actually undertaken efforts to track down contracts, like what long-term contracts are associated with certain facilities, and then assign the emissions from that. Other states are trying to look at the REC purchases so they can assign some of the sales as being clean and therefore being non-emitting. But it also depends on, like the saying is, how much time do you have? How much staff do we have? So very quickly, I can take the retail electric sales for all of the different state sectors, and I do that as I'm updating the inventory anyway. And then I assign the ISO New England average emission factor. And it's not necessarily the correct usage, because what if we happen to be using electricity at not very much during the peak, and so we're not emitting as much, but it's a good way for us to kind of get a sense of where our emissions are. And so we already have that inventory done, but it's the simplest way to do it. And it just kind of depends on the appetite of whatever group would be directing us to do a more complicated inventory, how much perfection is necessary in order to determine the impact that we're having kind of on the atmosphere. So, how much are we actually inducing in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? And I think when we do look at our electrical consumption, we haven't seen as much of a reduction in New Hampshire, because our electrical retail sales are relatively flat since about between the beginning of the recession and today. I think we're up about 1.1%. So there was a decline through 2011, but since 2011, it's been rising a little bit. The energy efficiency plans that we're putting in place, which were just filed on Tuesday, are trying to bring those sales down. I'm starting to get off track, but it all depends on how much specificity we want, and we can do it right now just using the average emission factor, but we could do it with a little bit more complexity if we had additional resources to do that.
Yeah, I would just throw out there, I think that's going to be a critical decision for this group to make is what do we consider that factor to be? How are we going to measure that? How do we look at upstream emissions from the various fuel sources for the power grid? And how are we going to, again, assign those numbers to the actual, any given kilowatt hour that's going to be consumed in New Hampshire. I mean, I don't think anyone would disagree that we should be considering the emissions that it took to generate any, incremental kilowatt hour that is being consumed in New Hampshire, not just the emissions that are, created, generated, emitted from power generation facilities that are physically located in New Hampshire. And so I'd be curious to think if anyone on the panel disagrees and thinks that, thinking about electricity emissions any differently than, again, sort of the ISO New England, sort of grids average, and again, as you're talking about, Chris, like, sure, you could get onto an hour by hour basis. What was New Hampshire's load at any given hour or minute or 15-minute interval, I suppose, and think about where did those individual sort of electrons come from. But if that seems complicated, but I guess I would throw out there the question for everybody would, does anybody think that we shouldn't be looking at the ISO New England grids emission profile as a whole and applying that to New Hampshire's electricity consumption? Does anybody think there's a different way we should be thinking about that?
Huck, I'm going to ask everybody to sleep on that one so that we can
Fair
get
enough,
into
Senator.
the questions. So we are getting close in terms of our time. I'm going to hopefully get the pronunciation right. Dr. Michael Doe, is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. Thank you, Senator.
Okay, you're next.
So thanks, Dr. Bush and Chris. And my question was for Chris, just a clarification in his presentation. The fact that New Hampshire had some of the biggest gains early in reductions, what is your sense, Chris, of why and what we did different from the other states to put us in the primary place of being the leader in reductions? Was it a different policy that we had, or was there any contribution in that we might have started out with dirtier plants and we had some low-hanging fruit that we could take care of? Like, is there a lesson that we can take from that success?
No, some of it has to do with the fact that when did they do the measurement and when did they look at the data? They happened to choose the data from 2005 to 2016 and 2017. And those were the 2 years where we saw the biggest drop in emissions in the electric sector, because it was also the time at which we had expanded our electric sector to include natural gas. So we had the 2 natural gas plants coming online. But then because of regional changes in electrical consumption, and then also the peak demand that was occurring within the region, there was less of a need for the coal plant to be running. And so it basically contracted, and it's running at a very small amount compared to where it was. It's not shuttered, but it runs very infrequently in comparison to what it had been. And so it was this changes in electrical generation and demand changed the electrical market. And so that natural gas displaced the coal for a time, and natural gas emits about half as much carbon dioxide per unit of energy generated. And so that's a big game changer right there. But then but the consumption within New England also meant that it was going down. So the natural gas facility was running less. So that also suppressed it. And so some of what was happening was the regional changes in electrical consumption, but just the particular mix that we had. Like if you look at our nuclear facility, it has not really stopped running except for like the seasonal shutdowns. It has provided a very steady amount of electricity. So where we've got low carbon, no carbon, or I mean a non-emitting source, that's continued to run because it's got a lower cost, lower amount of CO2, so it's not affected by the RGGI program. And so that's been our big influence, was just the facilities that we had running when they started the data set.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Let's see if we can get a couple more questions in here from people who haven't had a chance. I think, Roger, did you have a question? Roger Stevenson?
I'll pass, Senator. Thank you.
Okay. Representative Woods.
Yeah, this is perhaps too granular a question, but in the legislature, we're constantly dealing with the issue of net metering. It would be of interest, and I don't know if this is at all possible, to see the impact of changing the level of allowable net metering and the impact it would have on emissions production.
That's for Chris.
So I'm not going to, I can't answer the question of what happens if we change net metering, but ISO New England has modeled the impact of behind the meter solar. And they've found that it has had a positive influence on emissions because it has suppressed the need for generation from those larger facilities. So like the solar panels that I have on my house that are running during the day while I'm home makes my electrical use invisible. And so going forward, they found that behind the meter solar will continue to have a positive impact on electrical consumption that is in the region. So it'll be less than it would otherwise be. And then therefore it would have a positive impact on our emissions within the region by requiring that fossil fuel generators need to run.
I guess my thought was that if it were possible to quantify that, that would be something, and it's not, from what I understand your answer to be, it's not really quantifiable. But if it were, that would somehow, it would be a piece for us to use in the legislature to enhance number one, awareness, and also its efficacy.
Yeah, it might end. I'm sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Oh, I was just going to say, if in terms of this scope of this commission, I think if we're talking about the science targets and where New Hampshire stands relative to what the science is suggesting New Hampshire should be in order to do its part, net metering falls into kind of what I think of as a solution that would be considered after the goals are set. And where does net metering, where does solar policy, where does energy efficiency policy? And that's more of a planning exercise, similar to what the Climate Task Force undertook between 2008 and 2009, as they were setting the aspirational goals.
Let me just give one more opportunity for a question to James O'Brien, and then we're going to switch to the public comment session. And then if there's not a lot of public comment, I'd like to come back. I have two more hands raised, Senator Waters and Tom Irwin. So I'd like to circle back to you all if we have time. James.
Thanks, Senator. And this is, I think, a question for Chris, but Mike Fitzgerald might want to chime in as well. The first part's sort of a comment. So Chris, when I looked, your presentation was great. And one of my takeaways is that we've done as a state and probably as a region a very good job on the electric sector. And if you look at the curves that you showed, I mean, most of our emissions are coming from that sector, mostly because we've had a very focused policy effort, both here in New Hampshire, but regionally with RGGI, and then our RPS to really tackle those emissions and try to drive those down. But what I see when I look at your charts is that, we haven't had the same success or even near success on sort of the transportation sector, which is growing sort of its size of the pie. And so, as we stay laser focused, as the senator said, on sort of these emission goals that we're shooting for. It feels like the transportation sector is where we need to focus, at least some or not, a lot of our attention in order to achieve realistic goals that we might set, because we're not going to get there by sort of continuing to squeeze our electric sector. And so this is can New Hampshire do that on its own efficiently? So can we reduce emissions in our transportation sector as a state by ourselves through our own policy action in order to get that curve down where we need it to go? Or like RGGI, is this like a regional effort that we should be embarking on? So then my third part of the question is sort of unfair, which is, what do we think we can achieve by 2030 if we take the most efficient path forward on the transportation emission side to try to get that curve down? And obviously that's a simple question, because we'll still continue to achieve reductions in other sectors as well. But when I look at that pie chart, it's really that the transportation sector seems to be the nut to try to crack.
Jim, I'll take a quick shot at that. As you're well aware, there is a regional organization analogous to RGGI, which is the Transportation Climate Initiative. New Hampshire has been an observer, not a participant at this point. And so that's an organization that's trying to look at transportation emissions, and it's pretty much the same states as the RGGI states. You know, there's been obviously a lot of discussion and a lot of work done by states there, and that presents an opportunity potentially at some point. We also, you know, I think that probably one of the most significant things is going to be to try and focus efforts on trying to maintain federal car standards, vehicle standards that are have been proposed to be lowered, for lack of a better word, weakened, I guess. And so there's a couple of areas that we can provide some focus on. Again, like RGGI, we're a very small percentage of the region, but it may be also that if those states decide to take some actions, it may be very much like RGGI, where they if there's an impact in those states, that impact may be the positive or negative, depending on our participation here in New Hampshire. So I think there's a couple of things to look at there.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to have to jump in and switch over to the public section. So Andrew and Sheila, if you want to.
We have members of the public. If you'd like to raise your hand or post in the Q&A, we can get to our questions. I see we have a hand raised right now. John Gage, let me move him over. Sheila, were you able to elevate him?
Just on the public section, I think in the interest of time, we do need to limit comments to 3 minutes or less. And if there's a question, of course, the shorter the question, the longer the answer. So thank you so much. And remember, both participants and the public, please feel free to leave comments on the webpage and with Andrew, and Andrew can let you know how to do that.
John, you should be all set to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, one brief comment is that when I lobby Congress asking them to implement carbon fee and dividend legislation at the federal level, a common question we get in response is, well, have any states done this? So this is in response to J.J. Smith's comment. We can't really impact global greenhouse gas emissions in New Hampshire, so should we focus on other things? I'd suggest that, well, although we can slightly reduce global emissions, if we use a good policy and show Congress that it's possible, that the policy is viable and durable and people like it, that can help pass federal legislation. And with border carbon adjustments, we can push our carbon price around the world. And so the IPCC says any successful solution is going to include a global carbon price. So our state can have a really big impact depending on the policies that we choose to do. My second question is, the greenhouse gas metrics that we're using are a little misleading, I think, when we look at just CO2 emissions from fossil fuels that are burned in the US, or burned in the state. I'd really like to see the total greenhouse gas warming potential that we emit from the fossil fuels we use through their whole exploration, production, distribution life cycle, not just what we emit when we burn it, but when we switched from coal to natural gas. I'm reading now that it probably was a wash as far as greenhouse gas emissions total, because there's a lot more methane being leaked into the air, and that's a much more powerful greenhouse gas. So I'd like to see the whole picture in the metrics so that we can kind of get a clear view of our complete global warming footprint. Thank you.
Great points. Thank you, John. Do we have any other questions?
We have no other attendees with their hands raised. In the Q&A box, we had 2 questions that were answered in there already, but I don't see any additional.
Okay. And do we want to circle back quickly to, I lost those. Tom Irwin, Tom, do you still have a question?
I do, but it's rather granular, and I will I'll reach out to Chris separately. But just so folks know, the question I have, it relates to the piece of the pie in one of the pie charts attributed to waste. I was surprised that that sliver was as small as it was, and so I'm just curious to learn about the methodology for calculating GHGs associated with waste. But like I said, I'm happy to follow up with Chris.
Okay.
The quick answer is that we burn a lot of our methane for energy.
And Senator Waters, I think, had to drop off. He had a question. So I apologize for not having gotten his question in. I think we should, Roger, we only have a minute or two. If you could go ahead.
Yeah, I thought both presentations were just terrific, and I go back to adult asthma and childhood asthma, thinking of of Dr. Bush's presentation, and then looking at Chris's components of greenhouse gases, and particulate matter is one of those components. And I'm just wondering if we could switch this, sort of flip our thinking on the head and look at the emissions that could benefit public health within this 30-year time span that we have more immediately, because I don't think our emission reductions will affect our temperature in that time span, just New Hampshire's. But if we look at local emissions, particulate matter, for example, and its impact on respiratory illness, then we may get climate benefits as well.
Right. Great. Great point. I'm going to just say something very quickly and then turn it back over to Andrew to close up. I'm impressed. First of all, thank you to Dr. Bush and to Chris for awesome presentations. And I believe, Andrew, those are going to be on the website. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Great. So anybody who missed anything can watch it again, watch them again. I'm struck by the curve that shows the optimal continued decline in emissions, and the fact that we are going to be coming up to a year where we're going to cross that line and start plateauing. And that to me is a real challenge when we start talking about setting a reduction goal. And just a question I'm not going to answer because I don't have the answer, but is a reduction goal, is it a reasonable, practical goal, or are we looking at an aspirational goal that would reflect an ideal level based on current science? And I don't have an answer for that, but I think that's really bringing us back to the focus of the commission. And these were wonderful presentations and great discussion. So Andrew, do you want to close the evening?
Just wanted to, as a quick few housekeeping items, Catherine Bork was able to attend. She was on via call and in contact with me, and Courtney Tanner was an alternate for Zach Conway at Dartmouth Hitchcock. So just the record can reflect they both participated in the meeting. Also wanted to remind folks that the chat and the Q&A from tonight will be packaged and put up on the website along with both presentations and this complete meeting. That should be ready to go by middle of the day tomorrow. We very much appreciate all the presentations tonight and remind everyone that our next meeting will be on October 1st from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. and that the topic of that is emission reduction goals that have been set out globally at the state level and locally. And in closing, would also like to let folks know that we've had most people kind of join on the meeting right at 6 o'clock anyways. So just for the sake of kind of moving the time along, we'll probably have the official start of the meeting be 6 o'clock. We'll still send the presentations ahead of time for folks to view. But just so if we are able to finish a little earlier, we can kind of move right into our discussion period. So we'll have a 6 o'clock official time for the next commission meeting. Thank you all so much. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, everybody.